Hello, I'm Christopher Schultz, and today I'm going to be presenting the topic splitting your Tomcat installation for easier upgrades and downgrades. A little bit about me. I am an Apache Software Foundation member, also a member of the Tomcat community, a committer on Tomcat, and the project management committee, and also part of the security team. If you'd like to grab the slides for this presentation, they'll be available later. You can also snap the QR code that's on your screen if you want to follow along for some reason. I will be hopefully switching back and forth between the chat and the slides. But if you have a question and I don't get to it, please just hang tight. So let's talk a little bit about Catalina. I only found out 4 days ago that Catalina was an island off of Los Angeles. I'm sorry, not Los Angeles, San Francisco, but there it is. It's beautiful. And that's where the name Catalina comes from in the Tomcat architecture. So Catalina comprises Tomcat's core services, which include all the things that you can find essentially in the server.xml file. So that includes the service, the engine, the host, and all of the other things that you might configure there. Oh, Igal says Los Angeles. Okay. Somewhere over there on the West Coast. Most of Tomcat falls in the Catalina package and sub-packages. There's also a Coyote package, which includes all of the protocol handler, or not the protocol handlers, but the I/O mechanisms that Tomcat implements. When you have a simple deployment, you would download, let's say, the Apache Tomcat package, whether that's a zip file or a tarball or whatever. You would customize the server XML, you drop your WAR files into web apps, and then you launch your application, or you launch Tomcat. In some of these slides, I've tried to make it clear that you have a choice of BAT or SH or something like that. And I think at some point I just gave up and did everything as if it's on Unix, but we'll get to some Windows stuff later. That's pretty simple because all the configuration is in the conf directory. This is relative to the installation directory of wherever you happen to unpack Tomcat. So if you put it into the path I have on the slide, the example is opt Tomcat 9035. And that installation directory is known as Catalina Home. I've actually seen a lot of references to Tomcat Home on mailing lists and on the web, but Tomcat Home I don't think ever was a thing. People refer to Tomcat Home as if it's where Tomcat is installed, and I think everybody knows what you mean, but technically it's this Catalina Home environment variable. So even if you didn't know that that was happening, that's what's happening. There's another directory or a concept that is called Catalina base. And when I have it capitalized here, that means that it is an environment variable for your shell. And actually, when you launch Tomcat, the Catalina home and the Catalina base environment variables are copied into JVM system properties. So you can discover those if you look at the full command line of the JVM invocation. You can find it through JMX or a couple of other ways to discover that if you were just curious about it. But for simple deployments, the Catalina base and the Catalina home are going to be set equal to one another. Catalina home is where the server scripts and the binary artifacts live, while Catalina base has any custom scripts, the configuration for the server, the applications, the logs, and the workspace. That includes where generated class files for JSPs are, and that includes the work directory, which is where those go, and the temp directory. So if your application needs to write to disk for some reason and uses the servlet specified temporary directory, that's where it will be for that application. Many of the files in Catalina base are optional and will override those that happen to be in Catalina home. So there's a little bit of a disagreement right now as to whether or not this slide is 100% accurate. So I would be happy to hear some feedback from some of the other committers on this. The Catalina base that I use for my applications does not include a context.xml file. But all my applications have their own context XML files. So I'm not sure if I'm getting away with it because I don't need a default, or if the default doesn't exist, and actually it's always loaded. It always needs to be in Catalina base. So I'm sure we'll get that cleared up pretty soon. Some files are required in Catalina base. Almost by definition, the server XML file is required. The whole point of having a separated Catalina base is, or the whole point of having it is to host that file and the other files that are nearby. There are ways to override some of these things using configuration and system properties and environment variables, but that's where these files are expected to be. Some of these exceptions might be a little bit surprising to folks who haven't tried to do this before. The first one is a set class path script, which amusingly enough doesn't set the class path. That file, if you create it in Catalina base, will be completely ignored. And there's a couple of reasons for that. And the primary reason is you shouldn't be modifying that file. If you would like to set some custom parameters for Tomcat launch, you should be setting that in the set env script and not the set class path script. There's an endorsed directory, which can only be in Catalina home. That includes Java libraries, which need to have priority loading. That's very rare these days. I think it's been many years since you've had to make sure that your XML parser loads earlier than the Java virtual machine's built-in parser. So endorsed directory is not really relevant these days, and in modern JVMs, that's actually been completely removed. And the last one is the bootstrap jar needs to be in Catalina home. You can't override that, nor really should you. So why have these split Catalina home and Catalina base concepts? Well, the complexity gives you a lot of freedom because you can have one Catalina home shared by multiple instances of Tomcat, and then different configurations for each one. And there are a lot of other things that you can do here, but the thrust of this presentation is supposed to be about how easy it is to allow you to upgrade and actually downgrade your Tomcat if for some reason something goes wrong. Perhaps there might be a bug in the new release that you didn't find in some environment and you need to quickly roll back. It's a lot easier to downgrade than it is to roll back, especially if you have expanded the new version of Tomcat on top of the old version of Tomcat, which I wouldn't recommend. Why would you want to run multiple instances? You might want process isolation. So this would be multiple instances simultaneously alongside each other on the same server or on the same virtual machine. You can isolate the applications that are running in them from each other. So if one of them is untrustworthy or has some kind of problem which is making the JVM unstable, you can prevent one application from interfering with the other. The same is true for a security boundary. Again, if you have either a misbehaving application or one that has been compromised, that application couldn't be used to at least directly compromise a Java application running in a different JVM. You might be able to escalate your privileges and attack other processes, but you can at least have a security boundary between the two. You can also have different JVM configurations. For example, you may have an application that runs really well on Java 8, but when you run it on Java, what's out today, 15? When you run it on Java 15, it performs differently, or you haven't done enough testing. So some of your applications are running on an older version and some of them are running on a new version. This will allow you to do that, and very flexibly. It also allows you to do maintenance a little bit more flexibly because you're able to bring up and down those separate instances without affecting the applications that are running on the other ones. Let me just make sure that I have my timer nearby so that I can make sure I don't go over. I don't think I will, but it's always a good idea to check. All right. If you look at the running.txt file, which is in all distributions of Tomcat, you'll find everything that I'm talking about today under the advanced configuration section. It's pretty straightforward. You would install your Tomcat into whatever location that you'd like, and then set the Catalina home pointing to that directory. Then you create your Catalina base, and you can do that by, I just created a fictional Tomcat A directory from my home directory, and then set Catalina base equal to that directory. And then inside that directory, make sure that you have a conf directory, logs, temp, web apps, and work. You'll need to configure Tomcat by placing server XML, web XML, and Catalina properties, and Tomcat users, that should have an XML at the end of it, into the conf directory. Install your web applications in the web apps, and you can also do all of this except for that last portion by using, there's a script called make base in the bin directory, and that will do everything that is on this slide as well as on this slide. It does a little bit more. It copies all of the files that are optional out of Tomcat home into Tomcat, from Catalina home to Catalina base, and then you can customize from there. To launch your instance of Tomcat, ensure that both the Catalina home and base environment variables are set, and then launch the startup script. It's just like you would if you did not have these two concepts split into one, except that you're sort of running the code out of two different places. You're running the Tomcat code out of one location and your application's code out of a different location. So in Windows environments, everything is the same except use batch files instead of sh files, and you use different slashes. If you'd like to add another instance, Tomcat is already installed, so use the same Catalina home. You can make up another Catalina base like Tomcat B and perform all of those steps from the previous slides, and then make sure your Catalina base is set to the Tomcat B directory, and then run the startup. If you'd like to upgrade, you can stop Tomcat using the shutdown script, install a new Tomcat to the new directory, change Catalina home, and then start Tomcat. That's all you need to do. To downgrade, it's just the exact opposite process, which is stop, install an old Tomcat, or maybe just change to the existing or installed directory of Tomcat, and then start it up again. So upgrades and downgrades don't disturb your configuration, which is very important. The server.xml that you're using is always staying the same. So if you unpack a new version, say you're going from Tomcat 9.035, 35 to 9.036, and the server XML has changed in the stock deployment, you don't need to worry about that because your server XML is not being changed at all. Your web applications don't need to be relocated. You don't have to worry about overwriting any configuration files. So some caveats are, and this may be obvious to some, but it's worth mentioning, that the configurations are not compatible across major releases. Sometimes they are compatible, but you should expect that they will not be compatible. So if you would like to upgrade from Tomcat 8.5 to Tomcat 9, I would recommend taking a look at the differences between your server XML and the one that ships with the Tomcat base that you're using. Compare those two, and then apply similar changes to the stock server XML from the next version up, for example, Tomcat 9. The other thing that you have to pay attention to is that the ports obviously need to be changed. If you're running 3 applications, they can't all use port 8080 and port 8009. Another thing is that new configuration options are sometimes added. And if Tomcat adds a new configuration option that you would like to use, you will need to add that to your configuration. A very good example would be earlier this year, we had a security vulnerability through the AJP connector, and that required us to make some changes to the configuration to make it default to a safe config. And anyone who followed this process would have found that if they used the AJP connector, their application probably would not have worked just by following these upgrade procedures. You would need to change your configuration. And that's a very rare occurrence, but it sometimes does happen. To deploy multiple instances of Tomcat on as services on a Unix type system, essentially everything is the same. Install Tomcat and ensure that the home directory is set, or the home environment variable is set. Install your configuration and applications into your Catalina base directory and set that, and then run either startup or Catalina, depending on which one you typically would use. On a Windows service, you first have to install proc run as a Windows service. And usually you do that, the simplest way to do that is with the service.bat script, which is in the bin directory. Now it's worth pointing out that in order to get that file as well as the executable files which are necessary for Windows, you will have to get, on the Tomcat download page, you'll have to get the bundle that is listed as either 32-bit zip, or I think it's 32-bit Windows zip or something, or 64-bit Windows zip. If you just get the binary zip interface package, it will not include these files. I actually made that mistake earlier when prepping for this presentation. So once you set those 2 environment variables, if you run service.bat install and then give it a name, that Tomcat A, which has wrapped around to the second line of that item there, becomes the name of the service. So if then you run the Windows services snap in and go hunting around for the service, it will be called Tomcat A instead of, I think it's usually called Apache Tomcat and then whatever version number you've installed. So you can repeat that process for each instance. For example, if you wanted to install Tomcats A and B as Windows services, you would follow the same process here, setting Catalina home to the unzipped distribution of Tomcat. You'd set Catalina base to your Tomcat B, and then you would run service.bat install Tomcat B. And you can do that pretty much as many times as you'd like to do it. In order to upgrade the Windows service, there are a couple of things that you could do. The first is you could run, let's see, yeah, Tomcat. I chose Tomcat 9 in this case. But if you run Tomcat 9 executable with the edit service command and give it a specific name, that's what that //es//tomcat-a is. You're specifying that you'd like to edit the configuration for that service. And then you can manually change the value for the Catalina.home system property. So I apologize, I didn't take a screenshot of that. But once the service is installed, if you use that edit service, you can see in the system properties list that there's a Catalina.home system property, and you can just change the value of that to point to your new Catalina home. And then you can restart the service. If you'd rather not use the graphical user interface, you can dump out the configuration with a relatively new command for the service runner, which is the //ps, which stands for, I believe, print service. This actually dumps out a command line which will recreate the service, including all of the various options that the service was created with. So if you execute that print service on Tomcat A and then pipe it into a batch file like tomcat.a.bat, you can then edit that file, modify the Catalina home that's listed there and anything else that you want to change, and then simply run that script to update the service. You could also replace the service by deleting it manually and then recreating the service after having set those Catalina home and Catalina base environment variables. All right, that was nice and fast, wasn't it? I have a ton of time. So does anybody have any questions? Oh, John points out that each service name has to be different for each instance. And that was totally obvious to me, but it's probably worth mentioning. So yes, you must have a different service name for each service that you'd like to have. He also mentions that the Java home or JRE home needs to be set properly, and that is true. In some cases, I think that script can auto-detect the location of Java. I did not have much luck getting that to happen, so I had to explicitly set that. The service bat essentially won't run unless you have those set properly. So you'll get an error message if you haven't set those. Let's see, what time is this over? Oh, I'm actually perfectly on time. This wasn't intended to be rocket surgery. So I hope some folks who hadn't thought about doing this before might consider looking into it. I believe, but I'm not sure, that most Linux distribution packages of Tomcat include split installations because they don't expect you to throw your web applications on top of the package managed version of Tomcat. So if you're using one of those things, you can, you're already participating in this scheme. Let's see, startup port on Windows, -1 with procron. The startup port or the shutdown port? Probably shutdown. No problem. So yeah, if you don't specify a shutdown port, then one won't be opened. So you can run Tomcat without a shutdown port. All right, I'll give you guys maybe 30 seconds to queue up any more questions that you've got, and then I'll move on. Let me go find out what's next. If you'd like to stick around in the Tomcat track, our next session will be starting in 15 minutes or so. Remy Mouchara is going to be speaking about what's new and upcoming in Tomcat. Okay, someone has a Windows question, which I'm not going to be good at answering, but I'll try. Constantine points out that when developing web applications in Eclipse, and I would imagine that this is true of any IDE, so I don't know if anybody uses Visual Studio Code for this, but if you're using IntelliJ or anything like that, the configuration you'll get if you try to run your application from the IDE is going to be one of those split installations where you have a Tomcat directory in one place, and then your application and configuration is in another place. Paul points out that there is a bit of a cheat sheet for migrating between major versions of Tomcat. It's always a good idea to read through those migration instructions. I would say before you do any upgrade, but particularly when you're trying to go from one major version to another. All right, thank you very much for joining, and I'm sure I'll see you again.